just want to make it clear, since the restrooms are up here, feel free to pass right by if you need to. Okay, so first things first, what do people in the audience know about Carob or think they know about Carob? You can go ahead and just shout things out that you associate with it. What did you say? Oh, hippie moms. Yeah, that's okay. Beetles?
It's okay in small towns.
I've heard of Carob moths. I haven't heard of Carob beetles yet. Maybe you can teach me something. Oops. Where do I keep this pointed to get away from feedback? So anyway, I wanted to start to kind of know if anybody had more than the usual knowledge that I assume that people have around Carob and that's common in the United States. So here we are. We've got a Valentine's Day theme for tonight, which it was unavoidable that I had to talk about the chocolate thing, which actually I usually try my best to avoid. So here we are. In the US and the UK and to some extent Australia, people associate Carob with being a chocolate substitute. As you can see here, even the Church of Satan doesn't want anything to do with Carob. That's what I'm going uphill against every time I talk about Carob. I try to get people to care about it. So, I'm going to briefly deal with the chocolate comparison. Actually, the tough thing about this talk for me was when I got into the history of chocolate, it makes me want to dig even further into that, and I'm a master's student. It's my second quarter. I have plenty of other work to do. It was way more interesting to research this than it was to do what I'm supposed to do. So anyway, chocolate is made from cacao, which is native to Central America. Carob is made from carob, which is native to the Mediterranean. These plants lived completely separated from each other for millennia. The people who were using these plants lived completely separated from each other for millennia. They weren't the people using chocolate weren't thinking of it as a carob substitute. The people of using carob weren't thinking of it as a chocolate substitute. So here you go, and today what Carob deals with is the fact that people go, oh, it's such a terrible, it's not chocolate, it's traumatized me. And here you can see when the Europeans first tried chocolate, they weren't that wild about it. Foam on top and bubbles like feces, says Jose de Costa in 1590. And this is actually decades after they first tried it, so they kept that opinion for a while. But as you can see in the illustration on the right, this is that drink was made out of cacao, but also with some native, botanicals that the Europeans later substituted, and a close, that substitution became Mexican hot chocolate. So that drink, which was colored red, and it was very important to serve it foaming on top like that, as you can see that foam up there, was used to cement social relationships, and it was a high status drink. And that's what made Europeans overcome their distaste for it, because everybody likes status, everybody likes the rare drink, and especially once they brought it over to Europe, it was very rare. Only the rich people were getting those rich spices and things from other countries. And then, of course, they discovered there were stimulant properties to it. So they got over their distaste for it. So anyway, it's a very brief comparison, but I just wanted to point out that, not everybody in Europe thought that chocolate was amazing and carob sucked from the moment go. That kind of happened later. So how did I get into caring about carob? So I'm disabled, and it's a long story, but I went back to school in my late 40s, and I had a whole bunch of Gen Chem, Gen Bio, other stuff to get through. And as you may know, if you've taken these classes, they have very little plant content. And Gen Chem, especially the second semester of it, which is full of kinetics, was making me cry about once a week. I was trying to do something that would remind me, why am I putting myself through this? So I'm thinking, I want to become a plant breeder. Most community colleges in California don't have programs for that. How do I do this? I remembered these trees behind my grammar school, which are carob trees. And I thought, here's a tree fruit I can study. I don't have to make an appointment with a farmer. I can go 365 days a year. And so I started my own project, observing these trees. No faculty guidance. I just went out there with a clipboard and just started writing whatever I observed. And not long after I did that, I also started doing what I later learned was called literature review. Because I'm thinking, okay, well, I know what I can observe, but what do people generally know about carob? And I found just a lot of myths, and a lot of, the reason I can find tweets like that is because that's the majority of what I'm finding when I'm trying to research carob. So I ended up doing primary source research in a lot of archives and things like that. But let me get to the general stuff that you may not know about it, which is that, as I said, it's a Mediterranean native. It has a bushy growth form, but you can train it as a tree. There's none on this street, but like on 21st, if you used 21st to get here, you passed a number of carob trees on the way up here. There's a number of other carobs in Sacramento here. And they train those into tree shape. They prune off all the lower branches, and so they're these really beautiful evergreen trees, especially in the summer. That's the tree everybody's going to be under because it's really good shape. Yes, plants have sexes. I mean, we all know they have sex through pollination, right? But not everybody knows that plants actually, some of them have sexes. So this tree comes in male, female, and about 1% are hermaphrodite. And the thing that makes them culinarily important are these pods, which are full of a sweet pulp. So, like I said, it has a long history in the Mediterranean before they knew anything about chocolate. This is a Babylonian recipe for a lamb stew with carob. So most people here don't think of carob as a savory thing, but you can actually use it that way. This is an illustration from the tomb of Mena, which is New Kingdom, about 1490 BC, and they're harvesting carob. Yes?
Can I ask a question about their sexes?
Yeah.
So, like in humans, you have XX and XY.
Uh-huh.
But how does it work in carobs if you have also like 1% of them that are hermaphrodites? Like, what's the genetics that determines their sexes?
I have to say, I'm only in my second quarter, and my BA is in art. So what I can tell you is that I don't know if it shows up. I mean, it's got to show up in the genes in some way, but I don't know if it shows up in a sex chromosome per se. But when they talk about plants having sex, they're talking about the flower parts. So the male trees have only the stamens and anthers. The females only have the pistils. And the hermaphrodites, the like 1% of them that have it, will have both. So they won't need to be pollinated. They can pollinate themselves to some extent. But whether that shows up in an actual sex chromosome as opposed to just a gene on another chromosome, that I don't know yet. And honestly, you can imagine this is like really well funded. So maybe nobody else knows it yet either, I don't know. So anyway, culinarily speaking, the pods are what people are using. And these things right here, that fellow over there on the right is making syrup in the field. So behind him are carob trees, and he's taking the pods and he's got a bunch of water on top of that kettle and he's just boiling it until the sugars concentrate. And this is what you get off of it. So the syrup here was used to make the cheesecake, and this powder here, the flour, as they call it, was used to make the spoof. Both of those are made from the pulp. And you can also make, alcohol from this, both in terms of like drinking alcohol and just pure, alcohol that you want to use for disinfecting things. So the money crop for this is the seeds, which contain galactomannan. And that's used as a vegetarian thickener, so it's really common here in the U.S. to see that in the ingredients of cottage cheese, yogurt, ice cream. When you see carob bean gum, locust bean gum, it's from the seeds of these pods. Right now, what you will see a lot of is dog bakeries that use it, because chocolate will actually really mess with dogs. So they use carob instead. I mean, we all know dog bakeries are really marketing to the owners. There are plenty of other foods that aren't chocolate that dogs like, but for some reason, you know, they want them to have, like, they call them pup cakes. So they're carob pup cakes that they make, and but they can also, you know, be eaten by sheep and goats and whatnot, and it allows for some more sustainable farming systems. So anyway, getting back to the status thing, you know, in the days before sugarcane was making its way back to Europe, honey was what the rich used to sweeten things, and what the poor used to sweeten things was this. And it's one of the reasons the traditional uses for carob in the Mediterranean, it's like they're kind of only now rediscovering it, because a lot of people didn't. This was what kept people alive during World War I and World War II and the Spanish Civil War and stuff like this. People were living off of carob. So this is an example of, like, on the left is potitza, on the right is spoof. Oh, okay. It sounds so loud from up here that okay. So this is an example of some of the savory uses for it. On the left here, you've got halloumi, which is a kind of Greek grilling cheese. And on the right here, that's actually, I believe it's carob pasta, yeah. So the Greeks have a carob pasta, the Italians have a carob pasta as well. It's used as a drink. It's served a lot during Ramadan in Palestine and in Lebanon and Egypt. But also a lot of these countries, like that blue bottle is from Malta. This one here is from the Balearic Islands, and then the far right one is one I made myself, because you can't find imports of these carob liqueurs here, so I made my own. And I've never once had anybody taste it who didn't like it. I mean, even people who are like, oh, hippie food, blah, blah, blah. They all like this stuff. And I make a real point, like even this stuff, even though it's not like, you know, Instagram worthy in terms of presentation, I make a real point of not making health food with carob, because that's what the association everybody has. I'm not saying health food has to suck, but I'm trying to get away from the association people have. So anyway, it's been used. You can see this is a late 19th century illustration from, or it's actually a catalog advertisement from Britain. And Tragazole was what they were calling that stuff, locust bean gum, that we call locust bean gum and carob bean gum. And for the scientists here, like if you go to the Sigma Aldrich site, you will find look up LBG. Look up locust bean gum. It's something you can buy from Sigma Aldrich. So clearly people are using it. It's like there's actually a possibility it could substitute for agar in tissue culture media. Sizing is used, like if you sew, you buy fabric and it's kind of stiff, that's because they put sizing on it. And sometimes the sizing is this carob Tragazole. So here's the wood. So, you know, if you decide to grow this as a crop, which for some reason in the U.S., even though you can grow it in California, they've like aggressively decided not to. You take care of the tree for as long as you can, and then afterwards you can get this amazing wood out of it. And it's just as red as redwood. It looks beautiful. And it's actually highly valued by woodworkers because we don't have like lumber forests of carob. So I've actually, while I was doing my study with my clipboard, walking tree to tree, I saw a guy who whipped out his chainsaw and was going at one of the city trees because they had already cut the tree down, but they left like a big enough stump he could get some wood out of it. And like the neighbors were calling the cops and stuff, so a lot of drama. This is an example of what the Egyptians did with carob wood. This was a salvaged street tree. So here you are. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when it's trimmed. This is the most, I actually like wild looking trees, but this tree still amazes me. It's just, and this is in Pasadena, and you know, we were having like 115-degree summers. So you can see how thick the shade is here. Imagine you're in this house, which probably doesn't have very good central air. The value of a tree that throws that kind of shade just cannot be underestimated, and it doesn't take much water to grow that. So here you are. I just wanted to get back to the chocolate thing. I find this in my searches all the time. There are hugely long threads of people commiserating with each other about how scarred they feel that their parents told them that carob was chocolate. But really, if you just think of it as its own thing, it's cool. It's like if somebody told me that, like, I don't know, if somebody told me, served me egg noodles Alfredo or something, maybe, I don't know, or maybe those shirataki noodles and like called it pasta, I'd be upset, right? It's what you expect. But if you expect it to be what it is, you're not so upset by it. So, oh, by the way, yeah, saw a lot of these in my field work. So yes, right here with the sweater.
So you said a few minutes ago that like California like aggressively does not plant it. Can you why?
I'm still trying to get at all of it. It was a very popular tree during the 20s. They planted it a lot. And earlier in this thing, although I didn't point it out specifically, you saw a pamphlet because they were doing what they were doing with citrus, was they were telling everybody, move out to California, you can run a carob farm, it'll be a turnkey operation, we'll help you with it, you'll be a millionaire. A lot of people got really disappointed with that. So there was some backlash there. But what I meant by that was, like, in my study, I was looking, there's an industry in Australia, for instance, okay? And some of the cultivars that gentleman's growing in his farm and making a lot of good money from are cultivars that were found in California and were bequeathed to UC Riverside, San Diego Botanical Garden, USDA, all of those places either completely neglected them or actually mowed them down to put parking lots in. So that's what I mean by like aggressively not caring about it. Now why they decided that, some of that I'm sure is funding, but some of it I guess, I didn't have it in here again, but what I'm starting to trace through, if I look through successive years of like say the Western Garden book and stuff, there's just a point at which people start proclaiming what it is carob is and isn't based on no field work, based on no actual experience with it. So they're blaming it with things like people planting it as a street tree and then planting lawn around it and watering it shallowly 3 times a week. It's a drought-tolerant plant. It doesn't do well under those conditions. So things like that just sort of gave it a bad rep. Yes.
Yeah, how fast growing is the plant and when does it start fruiting?
Well, it's actually slow growing, and I'm seeing this as a trait in a number of drought-resistant plants. And if you think about it from a cell biology perspective, it makes a lot of sense, right? What are you filling most of your cell with? Water, right? So the faster you grow, the more cells you make and try to expand those vacuoles, the more water you need. So it's a slow-growing plant. However, it only needs like more than usual water for like the first year or two. And the next year or two, at least before we started having like serious climate change symptoms, most rainfall in the in the California here was enough to sustain it. So you didn't even need to irrigate it. Now you might need to irrigate it a little bit depending on what your new weather pattern turns out to be. But you can kind of set it and forget it, which is amazing to be able to do that with a plant that gives you this much. Okay, I'll remember you. Go ahead.
Well, I'm an entomologist, so I'm interested about like pests.
Mhm.
Have you seen anything eating it? Anything that affects it as insects, diseases?
It's actually remarkably tough. The biggest problem it has that I've seen, we don't have commercial operations growing it here, so I can't compare it in that situation. But in terms of how it works as a street tree, the biggest problem is that they were planted to be a drought-tolerant tree right before we had big irrigation here, and then people suddenly wanted their 50s, like British lawns and stuff, and they started irrigating it shallowly. Trees aren't stupid. If you put the water in the first couple inches of soil, guess where the tree's going to put its roots? And if you saturate it all the time with a tree that is developed for not being saturated, it starts to get root rot. And so you will see some people could view it as an additional crop, but it will result in the decline of the tree, but you will get shelf fungus on this. You will get, it's Lettiporus gilbertsoni, which is like kind of chicken of the woods type fungus. As far as insects, like there could be some opportunistic insects at that. There are moths that will lay their eggs in whether they're laying at the flower stage or the early pod stage, I'm not sure of yet. But they do lay them. And so sometimes you will have trouble in pods, like you'll see frass and things like that. But I haven't been able to submit those samples to a lab to get it really. In the past, some records I've seen, it's been ectomyloius. It's like navel orange worm or something like that. So ironically, even though we have Carob date moth in California, I don't know for sure that I've ever seen them on a Carob. Hold on, there's one more person back there for you.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I didn't even know there was a thing, and that was so much information. That was so cool. You mentioned in the beginning that you started doing this all alone, which is also really cool. But I'm wondering, have you since found like mentors or students to work with, or are you still going at this all alone?
All alone on my free time, and I was doing this on a disability check too, so that was my funding. I basically, would look. I've become really good at spotting carobs at like speeds, So the I-80 here, I-80 between Davis and Roseville has actually quite a few carobs along the sides, and Caltrans loves this tree because it's so tough. So there's a number of highways in California. I don't recommend you pull aside and do your field work there, but my advisor is reasonably cool about it. I do need to kind of dig in and start on, my master's project will be epicormic buds and almond. But once I get that kind of rolling, as long as he's still in the mood, I'm hoping to re-import that material that people didn't care about, because there's a whole bunch of germplasm this guy spent 40 or more years of his life selecting the same way that I've done, going around all over the state and going, this is a great tree or whatever. Because there's been no real breeding done on the species. Like literally, even in Europe where they actually do grow it commercially, everybody just picks like some random one that looks good. So you just think about it, does this much already. What would it do if you were actually putting breeding into it? So,
Good luck.
thank you. Yes, sir.
They give me a microphone. So why did the Asian people select it as a plant to harvest? Is it just the sugar, or is it the taste, or is there secondary compounds?
These pods, at least the ones we see here in California, I can't swear for the ones, it's been used long enough by humans that it's hard to break apart like the wild populations from the ones that have been a little more selected, even though no real breeding has happened. But at least in California, like even your average street tree, not a particularly good specimen, it's like 40% sugar in those pods. Now, if you don't have sugar cane and you're not rich and you don't have beehives, that's significant. So that's how you sweeten your food. But more importantly, that's how you get drunk.
And on that note, let's give another big round for Megan. Thank you again for the snacks. I was munching on this Carob cheesecake while you were talking.
Lisa,